An estimated 2 in 5 adults have obesity in the U.S., according to the CDC. But new weight loss drugs are changing the lives of many who struggle with weight and chronic conditions that go along with it. However, experts say these medications aren't for everyone. In today's Health Minute, Mandy Gaither has 5 facts about these new drugs that everyone should know.
The demand is skyrocketing. About 1 in 8 U.S. adults have used medications like Ozempic and Wegovy, according to a recent survey, and the drugs aren't just aiding in weight management.
We see them helping with blood sugar control and diabetes. We see benefits in heart disease, and likely to see more to come.
Dr. Scott Butch is director of obesity medicine at Cleveland Clinic. He says the first thing to know about these new weight loss drugs is that they're not for everyone. Right now, the medications are approved to treat people with obesity, not those trying to shed a few pounds. Second, the drug should only be acquired through an experienced, trained medical professional. Third, this class of drugs called GLP-1 may lead to more pregnancies because of how they work. And since there's not enough research on the effect this medication may have on a pregnancy, patients should stop taking the drugs at least 2 months before trying to get pregnant. Next, there are potential side effects. Butch says that includes nausea, vomiting, constipation, diarrhea, and fatigue. Finally, Butch says insurance doesn't cover the medication for weight loss.
Bias exists around obesity that affects both the reasons why insurance companies are not covering anti-obesity medications like these, as well as why certain implementation of obesity treatments, like seeing a dietitian, for example, isn't covered by most insurance companies.
For Health Minute, I'm Mandy Gaither.
The FDA has also warned consumers about potentially dangerous counterfeit versions of these new weight loss drugs, another reason to only get them from a trained medical professional. More people could qualify for Social Security. We'll tell you who's being considered up next.